Welcome to Telling the Truth 2020 at the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany, State University of New York. I'm Mark Koplik, Assistant Director of the Institute. A virtual symposium on politics, journalism, tribalism, polarization, and the future of democracy in America, Telling the Truth 2020 brings you conversations with major thinkers, writers, journalists, and public figures from across the political spectrum. Join us here on our website and on our YouTube page for more conversations. We're extremely excited to be here today with Amy Chua, whose best-selling book, Political Tribes, Group Instinct, and the Fate of Nations, has helped to frame the conversation that many of us have been having about the phenomenon of identity politics. It's one of the most illuminating studies of identity politics available. It's helped many of us make sense of what has happened in this country over the last several years. It brings together some of the most valuable work in neuroscience, psychology, and political science in order to understand polarization, group identity, fractures along lines of race and class, America's foreign policy failures, and the nature of political violence. More than that, it's a pleasure to read. The writing is crystal clear, accessible, and extremely economical. You can purchase it at a local indie bookseller from a link on this screen. Amy Chua is the John M. Duff Professor of Law at Yale Law School. In 2011, Time magazine named her one of the most influential people in the world. Her previous works include two best-selling books on foreign policy, World on Fire and Day of Empire, and the runaway global bestseller, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, about the differences between Western and Chinese parenting. That book has been translated into 30 languages. Amy, thanks so much for being here at the University at Albany.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Mark. Thank you for having me.
So at UAlbany, we're proud of the fact that we're one of the most diverse Tier 1 research universities in the country. Our students represent over 90 nationalities and over 100 languages. We try to provide a welcoming home for people from largely white and rural upstate communities, as well as folks from the multicultural metropolises and everyone between and outside those communities. We like to think of ourselves as one big family. Is that kind of super group, as you describe it in the book, a group that transcends tribal identities? Is that a realistic thing to achieve? And what's the best approach to making that work?
Yeah, you could probably tell from reading my book, Mark, that I'm an optimist. And I will say that as the last several years, it's gotten harder and harder to remain an optimist. There's a lot of bitterness and polarization. And, it's gotten to the point where people who voted for one side can barely talk to people who voted for the other side. And it sometimes we despair. But yes, it's funny. This concept of a supergroup is actually so simple, but it's also really what captures what's unique about America. And I think we all get spoiled and we forget about this. So for people who don't know what I'm talking about, I came up with this idea, supergroup, to mean very simple thing. To be a supergroup, you have to satisfy two conditions. The first is to have a really overarching, strong national identity, like Americans. But the second condition is actually what is so much more rare to have in conjunction with the first, and that is that you have to allow all kinds of subgroup identities to also flourish. And at our best, Mark, we are a country where someone can be Irish American or Italian American or Chinese American or Cuban American or Syrian American and intensely patriotic at the same time. And we forget how rare this is. Like even France, which is sort of like us, it's a Western democracy, they've got a constitution, they're not a supergroup because they've got this really strong overarching national identity. You're French. But as you know, if you read the newspapers, they do not allow subgroup identities to flourish. You can't wear a headscarf, or there's the burkini ban. And so Muslim French and all the people from North Africa, they feel that their identities can't coexist with the national identity. And if you go through all the countries in the world, China, it satisfies condition one, very strong national identity, but Tibetans and all the minorities can't flourish. So we have something special, and I think it's because of our ethnically and racially neutral constitution.
And at this political moment, you say you're still an optimist. How do you remain an optimist?
Well, first, I think that some of the ugliness that we're seeing right now, just so much hatred, and I mean, even the pandemic was tribalized. Like for me to just find out if a certain drug works, I have to flip between MSNBC and Fox News to sort of split the difference. Like it's so, it's just so difficult. But I do think that something people forget is that for hundreds of years in this country, a lot of voices were silenced. They were just too powerless. So part of this disaster and anger that we're hearing is the result in part of lots of previously suppressed voices finally having a chance to air their grievances. And the reason that I remain an optimist is that I believe the loudest, most bitter voices that we are hearing and that get retweeted and that make the news are actually a small minority of what real Americans feel. I really think, and I know this from personal experience from my school where I teach, that there is a huge silent majority of Americans from whatever background that are so tired of this traumatic fighting and calling each other out and just this, kind of race to the bottom. I'll tell you a quick story. I teach really the most diverse class at Yale Law School, but not just in terms of lots of minorities, which I do have, but I'm very proud of the fact that my class, it's just called International Business Transactions, but it has a very large conservative block. That is a lot of members of the Federalist Society who at our school absolutely do not talk to the minorities and progressives. And but in my class, I also have the largest block of people of color and progressives, and they're all in there. And on my syllabus, I had put this banner like, this class is going to aggressively promote civil debate from people of all backgrounds, and basically don't take this class if you can't handle that. If you can't just say, oh, that's racist, I'm not talking about it. And my dean and actually a lot of administrators said, oh, you're going to get nobody. You're going to be boycotted. You'll get 3 people. Well, because that's kind of what goes up on the internet. No, the opposite. I capped the class at 80. I had a wait list of another 100 people. And that's what I mean by the silent majority. I think they're afraid to be out there because it's so bad now that it used to be that my students who were conservative would, like JD Vance, who wrote Hillbilly Elegy, was my student. He's a conservative. His closest friend when he was here at Yale was a lesbian, super progressive woman. I just don't know if that can happen anymore. It's so difficult. If you're a progressive and you try to be friends with a conservative, you're called out. So, but my point is that when you just kind of take a stand and just say, okay, I'm going to teach this class. This is take it or leave it. These are the rules. People wanted to do it. So that's partly why I'm an optimist. I think that at bottom, we're all human beings. And, people say that if you put a Trump supporter and a Trump hater together, you don't have them talk about politics, but talk about pets or pizza or sports or babies. It's amazing how fast they form stuff to talk about, human bonds.
Right. So you talk about the neuroscience of group identity in the book and how good it feels to belong to a group and how good it feels to exclude others and even to witness the misfortunes of people in the out group. How can our students on this extremely diverse campus overcome those terrible impulses that seem, according to some scientific studies, to be hardwired in us?
Yes. So you're raising a very good point. There are some more, worrisome studies in my book. Absolutely. It's completely proven that humans, like our fellow primates, are tribal creatures. We need to belong to groups. Think how many hermits there are in the world, almost none, and once we connect with a group, we tend to want to cling to it and defend it and see it as better in every way. studies show that it's almost like the effect is like a drug. When it's like sports, when your team does well, you just, even if you're not really benefiting personally, you just feel so good. And yes, studies show that under certain circumstances, our brains light up when we stick it to the other side. So the way that I think to get around this is those sort of hateful tribalistic feelings, they're always kind of latent. That's the way human beings are. But tribalism's not always bad. In sports, it's really fun. I'll be the first to say I'm a very tribal person. I'm very loyal to my friends, my family. It's really when tribalism takes over a political system. That is when things get dangerous, because then facts and debates and data and policy don't matter. You just stick to your side no matter what, and you can't even talk to people on the other side. So among the things that I've proposed are, there are all these positive studies that show if you just get two people to be able to interact as human beings, again, talk about pizza or just children or something, that's human nature too. People will instantly form that bond. So back in the day, in the 50s and 60s during Vietnam, we had the draft, mandatory draft, and terrible things happened during Vietnam. But one very positive thing I write about is wealthy people, poor people, people from rural areas, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Irish Americans, they were thrown together. And the studies on that front are actually quite beautiful. They say, when you're afraid for your life, you're in a place you don't know if you're going to survive, you're terrified, and your life is in the hands of your fellow soldiers, you don't care what color skin they have, you don't care what accent they have. So how can we reproduce that now that we don't have a draft? And one idea that I've been talking about, and I think it might be an idea whose time has come, is the idea of a national service program for young people. So a lot of people now after high school, they take kind of like gap year. They often just go to like Europe or Australia, Guatemala. What if, Mark, we, encouraged or even gave, incentives, scholarship incentives for people from, I don't know, New York City and San Francisco, these kind of coastal elite types, private school types, they go to a part of the country, that's more rural, or blue collar, and work side by side with other young people, not in a condescending way, like we're going to teach you this, but just side by side on housing, on plants, on infrastructure. I mean, the country needs so much help right now, post-COVID. And I think it's really an exciting idea. And right now, the biggest problem contributing to this hatred is, I think, this mutual ignorance and disdain between the people on the coasts, the kind of cosmopolitan people, and the people in maybe places that you draw students from, more rural areas, working class areas, parts of America that people call the heartland. So I think that would be one great way of beginning to bridge the divide.
Yeah, we were, UAlbany was recently rated one of the best universities in the country for Peace Corps preparation. And this kind of idea, may, really resonate with some folks on campus. So if you'd like to start a movement, should people be reaching out to you, or what do you advise them to do? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always controversial, but that's partly because I'm so stupid. My email is totally public. If you look on the Yale Law School website, it's amy.chua@yale.edu. And I mean, I tend to be very responsive. Sometimes my volume's high, but I think that's part of, and I especially love meeting people like you describe your students are. If you look online, my reputation is actually helping students from marginalized groups or historically underrepresented groups, students from state colleges, community colleges, because there are lots of different groups that don't have the same access. And it's not always about just only race or ethnicity. There are a lot of class differences and geographical differences also.
Great. So if you'd like to start the first chapter of this national service program, I'm addressing students now, please reach out to Amy Chua, whose email is public. So I think a lot of us in upstate communities, I'm sure it's not unique to us, we live in kind of non-homogeneous, not politically homogeneous communities, and we have a big community audience that watches these conversations, listens to them. And I think we do get by talking about pets and pizza and babies. But should we be engaging with our neighbors? We have genuinely friendly relationships with these folks who live in close proximity to us. Should we be engaging with them more substantively, politically?
I think, of course, yes, but this is one of these things, and I'll just be very honest. I teach on the most liberal campus in the country, and I think it's subconscious. It goes back to this tribalism, that there's people who think that they're being really inclusive and universal are often much more exclusionary than they think. So one thing I've noticed among really liberal college campuses is that there's a vocabulary. Some people call it political correctness, but that term is controversial itself. But it's sort of like, don't say Latino or Latina, you have to say Latinx. A student of mine from actually a rural area said she's very liberal, but she was called out because she used the term prisoner. And she actually wanted to help prisoners, but she was like, you can't use that term. You have to use the term incarcerated peoples. And so I think in a way, you almost need to have the will inside you to really want to engage. And I think that's what's tricky. It's kind of like fighting with a boyfriend or a spouse. You kind of know sometimes in your heart if you really want to try, or if you're actually just angry and think they're being stupid and you want to fight some more. So there are these successful cases. For example, there was something after the 2016 election. Some really liberal kids out in Berkeley were so horrified by the election of President Trump, they just sunk into a depression. But then about a few months later, they said, we've never actually met a Trump supporter. And they started something, I don't know if it's still going on, but it was doing great, called Make America Dinner Again. And it was just what you're talking about. They made dinner parties, bringing people from different sides of the political divide. And to use your term, actually engaging and talking about some of these, including some pretty tricky things. And I think they did make great progress. I don't want to sugarcoat this, like issues like immigration or abortion or death penalty. I mean, I teach in a law school. These are so charged. And as soon as people start tossing around terms like murderer, racist, then it kind of shuts down. And this goes back to the way I try to teach my classes. I'm like, just for my class, if another student says something that you think is racist, instead of calling out the racism, you have a right to be very angry, but just stand up and raise your hand and express what it is that you found so objectionable in words, and give the other person a chance to respond. And you can still be angry, but let's do that. And I found that worked. And I think that's one of the problems with our dialogue right now. If somebody says, I think we should have immigration restrictions. Oh, you're a xenophobe. You hate Muslims. So we can't even have this conversation about, things like immigration. We need to have conversations about that. We really, it's a very, I'll be cards on the table. I'm an immigrant's kid. Of course, I am a very pro-immigration person. But I also don't think we can just let everybody in. I think we need to have some rules. And so we need to have these conversations. And the way tribalism has kind of paralyzed the country, it's almost like people just throw around these buzzwords that their team's using, and we never really get anywhere.
Yeah. So a lot of folks right now are worried about political violence. And you have this very wise and very chilling quote from Friedrich Nietzsche as the epigraph in one of your chapters. Insanity in individuals is something rare, but in groups it is not rare. And I wondered, it's so frightening to realize that terrorists are not mentally ill in some clinical sense, according to many psychologists. So how can we deal with it? How can we diffuse it? And are you worried? And should we be worried?
Yeah, I'm very worried. Like I actually looked at all these studies about people in ISIS and terrorist groups, and it was really surprising what I learned. I'm not the original psychiatrist doing these studies, but it shows that people who are really nice, as you say, they're not mentally ill, they're just like nice people, but something bad happens to them. Maybe they lose a parent, or they're frustrated, or even just a girlfriend breaks up with them, or they're going through a bad time. And then they get into this group where it's like you get this, it's almost like a sports mentality. People know what it's like to be in a big stadium, you almost go crazy. And the studies show that there are all these neurochemicals that start firing off, and it's shocking how quick, at a certain point, after like 3 months of training, like, this is the enemy, they want to kill your parents, we must kill them. And you get these kids that were just nice people 6 months ago, they're just kind of just almost brainwashed. So I try to think about how can we not get to that point? Because once we get to that point, like you're in the middle of a rally and you've got this enemy thing, it is very hard to stop. It's again, I like to analogize to sports stadiums. Imagine in the middle of the Super Bowl, and you're cheering for your team, and you're like, hey, I want you to cheer for the other team now, or go for all football players. It's gonna be, are you kidding? So in political tribes, the main thing that I've done for the United States is I've tried to identify why we have this tension now. What makes this moment different from every other moment? And as you know, one of the factors I identify is that for the first time in US history, whites are on the verge of losing their majority status, at the national level. I mean, for 200 years, this country was kind of dominated economically and politically and culturally by a white majority. And obviously a lot of bad things happened because of that, slavery and persecution. But this is a weird thing to say. When you're that dominant, you can also afford to be more generous and kind of more universal. And in the 60s and 70s, a lot of white people, just WASPs, opened up the Ivy Leagues, opened up the colleges to more Jews and minorities and African Americans, because they felt it was the right thing to do. At this moment, we're not like that now, because because of affirmative action and how hard it is to get into colleges and all these things, understandable things, whites now also feel threatened. So I think one of the reasons we're seeing the dynamics is minorities feel threatened, whites feel threatened, everyone feels that they are the ones being persecuted and subject to discrimination. So for me, it kind of goes back to how can we pull people out of these little tribes? Because when you feel threatened, that's when groups, they get more us versus them. They start not talking to the other side. They're like, oh, we gotta hunker down with our own people. So all of the policies that I have seen work are ones that are the opposite. They're the ones like you're trying to do with this program, or what I try to do in my class, which is you get people from opposite sides and say, come on, I'm going to create a fun space. Just give us 30 minutes, give us a couple hours. Let's start having a conversation. I think maybe it's the optimist in me. Maybe if things just get so bad in this country, people are finally going to get exhausted, and also leadership at all levels makes a huge difference.
Yeah, you talk about the American dream, and at UAlbany, we often boast about being one of the top-ranked schools in the country for promoting social mobility. We move students from families at the more disadvantaged end of the economic spectrum into the prosperous middle classes. And in the book, you talk about the allure of the American dream and how it appeals especially to those at the bottom, of all colors. And on the other hand, you talk about the fact that progressive elites feel committed to exposing the American dream as an illusion for those who experience discrimination and generational poverty. In other words, there's often a sharp disconnection between political activists or progressive academics and the folks that they seek to help.
Absolutely. And
does that complicate the mission of this university or any university?
Very much so. And it's a huge problem. And every time I say this, I get in trouble. And I'm like, why should this be controversial? But I have noticed that, so first of all, it's a matter of extremes. It's good for progressives to point out that, hey, for most of American history, there were huge groups that were excluded completely from the American dream. And I think that's great. We don't want to whitewash history. What I object to is sometimes I think that activists and progressives throw the baby out with the bathwater. they're like, oh, this is it's completely true that the constitutional protections didn't extend to African Americans. We had slavery. And, I think, but what I say to my students is there's a huge difference between saying we have an amazing constitution with principles and values that, are so noble, but that we have shamefully failed to live up to, and we've got to do better. There's a huge difference between saying that and saying, oh, this constitution is just a hokum. And America was actually built on white supremacy and genocide. And because if America really was only built on white supremacy and genocide, then it's hard to see why it's worth fighting for. And similarly with the American dream, it's completely true that so many people, especially right now, there's a lot of disturbing signs that education is so expensive, student loans, and I've talked a lot about how we have to make social mobility real again. So hats off to Albany. But I do agree with you. I find it's often very privileged people, wealthy people who can afford to protest all day. They don't need to work. They're going around saying the American dream is dead. We need socialism now, and it's actually you're just being hierarchical if you believe in the American dream. And I just think it's gone too far. I think it's almost like a game. It's part of their identity. This is what we're trashing the American dream. Whereas for a lot of people, it's their lifeline. Like like my own parents came over with very little. For a lot of immigrants, they want to believe that if I work hard, it's no guarantee, but with a little luck, I can make it. And so I think we both have to make policies that really make social mobility more real. But we also have to, stop just, I don't know, I just say throwing the baby out with the bathwater, kind of just saying America is the worst country on earth, white people are the worst people on earth, the founders are all rapists. I think we're just going to forget what makes this country special. And again, the one thing that can hold all these groups together, rural and urban, immigrant, non-immigrant, old, young, is actually the values of the Constitution. And I go back to that. We keep forgetting how unique it is that our Constitution is ethnically and religiously neutral. And most of the countries in the world were founded as ethnic nations. And we were not. We were founded on ideas and principles.
So is there anything you'd like to end with that's really optimistic?
Well, it's so funny. I just spoke to my own students. I will say this is not about political tribalism, but I have found that there's a silver lining to everything, I'm, much older than these kids. But I've often found that if you just stick to it, it's this thing, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I really do believe that. I was just giving my own students this speech of all the rejections and failures that I've suffered. I told people that when I applied to be an academic, 30 years ago, I applied to 100 schools to be a professor. I got 100 rejections. So I'm just like, hang in there. And back to this tribalism, just stick it out, kind of believe in yourself, believe in the country, believe in the values, and stay generous. And if enough people do that, I think there's gonna be light at the end of the tunnel. I really do.
The book is Political Tribes, Group Instinct, and the Fate of Nations. It's available for purchase at an indie bookstore via a link on this page. We recommend it for everyone of all political tribes. The author is Amy Chua, and it's been such a pleasure to have her here with us. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you so much. This was a highlight. Thanks.
And please check out the many conversations that are part of our virtual symposium, Telling the Truth 2020. Thanks for joining us. Be well and be safe.